Hey guys, how are you doing? Good? Sleeping? Awake? Alright. My topic is not meningitis, first of all. It is a patient with fever, altered sensorium, and seizures. So, how many of you agree that fever, altered sensorium is synonymous with meningitis? Just one. Alright. And how many of you agree that patient with fever, altered sensorium, and seizures is synonymous with meningitis? Alright, so first of all, I am going to discuss about the differential diagnosis of fever with altered sensorium. So what came first, the chick or the egg? Fever के बाद altered sensorium है या altered sensorium के बाद fever है. So that determines whether your brain is involved or not. Alright, so fever with altered sensorium, the first thing that comes to your mind is infections because the patient has fever. Alright, and for fever with altered sensorium, the thing that comes to your mind is meningitis, encephalitis. Can anybody differentiate what is meningitis and what is encephalitis? Meninges involved, meningitis, if the brain parenchyma is involved, encephalitis. So how do the symptoms differ between the two? When do we call it meningitis, when do we call it encephalitis? I can't hear anything. Alright, so you have signs of meningeal irritation in meningitis like fever, stiff neck and stuff. I'll discuss them. And when your brain parenchyma gets involved, you have symptoms of cortical dysfunction like seizures. So when we're talking about fever, altered sensorium and seizures, we are talking of encephalitis. And encephalitis doesn't occur alone most of the times. It is a spectrum called meningoencephalitis. Alright? Other things that may cause fever and altered sensorium may be cerebral malaria in endemic areas. We have brain abscesses which may cause fever and altered sensorium. And then if the fever came first and altered sensorium occurred later, we may also think of sepsis-associated encephalopathy. Now, apart from infections, there may be some other non-infectious causes of fever and altered sensorium as well. And the most important of them all to consider in an ICU setting is a neuroleptic syndrome. Have you heard about that? Okay, fever, altered sensorium and muscle rigidity. Alright, so consider neuroleptic syndrome as well in the DD. You may have drug overdoses like salicylates and amphetamines, etc. that may cause fever and altered sensorium, but no seizures. Alright, then there may be other DDs like heat stroke, and one important thing that you need to rule out is the structural lesions in the brain. What kind of structural lesions? Where your thermoregulatory response is impaired. And which are those lesions? Hypothalamic involvement, very good. So hypothalamic lesions, brainstem lesions, stroke of brain stems, IVH, SAH, all of these present with fever and altered sensorium. And another important DD is cerebral fat embolism. What occurs in that? Fever, altered sensorium. So consider that in patients who have a history of trauma. Alright, so this was about the DD. But to say that the diagnosis of acute infective meningoencephalitis is suspected in a febrile patient who presents with altered consciousness and signs of diffuse cerebral dysfunction. And so we talk about meningoencephalitis in this talk. So in a study from India in pediatrics where age was less than 18 years, the commonest cause of acute febrile encephalopathy was viral encephalitis, accounting for around 40% of cases. Next to this was bacterial meningitis and then tubercular meningitis and cerebral malaria. So first we come on to the etiology of meningoencephalitis. The commonest, I just told you, is viral. So in viral, the most dreaded one is herpes simplex. Alright, herpes simplex encephalitis, we may also have Epstein-Barr, varicella zoster, cytomegalovirus, adenoviruses and arenaviruses like Japanese encephalitis. How many of you have seen Japanese encephalitis in cases? Well, quite a few actually. Alright, next DD is bacterial meningitis. Now bacterial infections present first as meningitis, signs of meningeal irritation. The patient is usually very sick. The patient has a bloodstream infection, patient is very sick, he presents with high-grade fever, signs of meningeal irritation and so on and so forth. I'll discuss the bacteria that cause bacterial meningitis later. We may also have rickettsial infections in endemic areas. We may have fungal infections like cryptococcosis in patients who are immunocompromised. And we may have parasitic infections again in endemic zones. So consider Plasmodium, Toxoplasmosis, etc., etc. right? I was talking about bacterial meningitis. You need to know which are the commonest bacteria which affect the different age groups. Alright, so there are two kinds of bacterial meningitis. There is a community acquired, the patient directly comes to you from the community, or it may be a hospital acquired. The patient had undergone a neurosurgical procedure and then got an infection of the brain. Alright, so the commonest pathogens that are involved for community acquired are Neisseria, Streptococcus pneumonia and Haemophilus influenza, and in elderly patients and immunocompromised, additionally you have to consider Listeria and aerobic gram-negative organisms. I tell you about these bacteria because the management in each patient subgroup will depend upon this. Alright, hospital acquired, the most common is CONS, coagulase negative staph. Especially in patients who have a prosthetic device in situ, like patients who have VP shunts. So the commonest organism causing meningitis in these patients is coagulase negative staph and aerobic gram-negative bacilli. So whenever you're suspecting nosocomial meningitis, think of resistant gram-negative microorganisms first. Alright? Okay, so now this patient has come to you. How do you proceed? The first thing that you do is you elicit a good history. And in history, you elicit the classic triad of meningitis, and that is fever, stiff neck and altered sensorium. These are called signs of meningeal irritation. I hope everybody knows them, but only 46% of the patients have this classic triad. So look out for the risk factors. The risk factors may be presence of prosthetic devices, a recent neurosurgical procedure, patient is immunocompromised, he has asplenia, he has diabetes, HIV, immunosuppressive drugs, steroids, chemotherapy, radiotherapy. You also have to consider geographical and seasonal factor, contact with animals, dog bite, insect bite. I was just talking about the endemic things. Foreign travel, the patient has traveled to an endemic zone with malaria. Occupation, the mode of onset and progression of symptoms is very important. If you see a patient who has rapidly progressive symptoms, suspect meningitis, suspect bacterial meningitis. Drug intake history, again it is important. I was talking about the neuroleptic malignant syndrome. Yes, I was talking about steroids causing immunosuppression and then meningitis. So, drug history is another important thing. Coming on to the physical examination, I think all of you would have studied these signs. Kernigh's, Brudzinski's, jolt accentuation. What are these? I will not emphasize them. It is flexing the hip and extending the knee to elicit pain in the back and legs. That is the Kernigh's. Brudzinski's is passive flexion of the neck will elicit a flexion of the hip. And jolt accentuation is you move your head and your headache increases. Alright, so in examination you also have to see the skin and mucous membrane because rashes are very common in meningococcal meningitis. So meningococcal rashes, you may also have them in rickettsial fever, varicella zoster. Alright, what is this? The glass? The glass test, very good. The rashes in meningococcal meningitis do not blanch, very good. So you may look out for hepatosplenomegaly, the lymph nodes. Lymph nodes would be enlarged in which kind of meningitis? Sorry? जोर से बोल दो कोई. Tuberculosis, okay. Other sites of concomitant infection, URI fever, influenza or mycoplasma. So now the patient has altered sensorium. So you need to do a detailed neurological examination. So in neurological examination, the first thing that we do is pupils. You have to see the size and reaction. Fundus for papilledema. You have to see any cranial nerve involvement. Which cranial nerve would be involved? Sixth, very good. Abnormal movements, decerebrate rigidity and focal neurological deficits which include hemiparesis, weakness of one side, aphasia, ataxia. You may have cranial nerve deficits, involuntary movements, partial seizures. You may have papilledema. Alright? Investigations. So what investigations do we send in such patients? The blood investigations, the routine ones, CBC, coagulations, LFT, RFT, ABG and so on and so forth. So you see relative lymphocytosis in viral encephalitis, you have leukopenia and thrombocytopenia in rickettsial infections, peripheral blood smear is sensitive in cases of malaria. Blood cultures, very very important to send in a patient who is suspected with meningitis. The reason is it is positive in around 30 to 80%. Usually meningitis occurs as a hematogenous spread. Alright, so it is very essential to send blood cultures at the time you see the patient first. Chest radiography, why is it important? It may point towards a possibility of, yes, the first thing, what is this? Very good, and what is that? Plasma, alright. Very intelligent audience. Okay, the next thing that we do is lumbar puncture for CSF analysis to see which kind of meningitis it is, whether it is meningitis or not, and what kind of meningitis it is. So be careful not to do a lumbar puncture in a patient who has an increased intracranial pressure. The reason is brain herniation would occur. So IDSA has given certain guidelines for adult patients with suspected bacterial meningitis who should undergo CT scan prior to a lumbar puncture in all elderly patients greater than 60 years, in immunocompromised patients with HIV, post-transplant, post-chemotherapy, patients who had a history of CNS disease, which means a mass lesion, stroke or focal lesion, a new onset seizure. For seizures, you always have to rule out a structural cause before you proceed on. And abnormal neurological findings like papilledema, depressed level of consciousness and focal neurological deficits. In all others, you may proceed with a lumbar puncture, but in these cases, you should do a CT scan before you perform a lumbar puncture. So when you take your CSF, what do you send it for? First of all, the first thing is the CSF opening pressure. Yes, the normal one is 5 to 20 is the normal. Gross examination, your CSF looks turbid. It indicates infection. So the commonest investigations that you send for CSF are cytology, biochemistry, gram stain culture. The four things that you never have to forget: cytology for the cells and the type of cells, biochemistry for glucose, protein and chlorides. Glucose, proteins hold importance, gram stain and culture sensitivity. Alright, an additional one that we do now is CSF lactate. More important in patients who have a hospital-acquired meningitis, because they are diagnostic of bacterial meningitis in these subgroups. Alright, apart from this, we have Zeal-Nelson staining and AFB smear for TB meningitis and India ink staining for fungal meningitis. So this is how a normal CSF picture would look like. Normally, the CSF would have just 1 to 5 cells, either no cells or maximum to 5, and most of them are lymphocytes. Presence of neutrophils is not normal. Alright, normally proteins are 15 to 45 milligrams per dl and glucose is more than 2/3 of the plasma glucose. Alright, no absolute values, it should be more than 2/3 of your plasma glucose. So whenever you do a lumbar puncture, please measure your random blood sugar. Alright, so as to compare and see the ratio of the CSF and the plasma glucose. Alright, so this is the table that you need to memorize with all your heart. Right, this is the normal thing. I'll discuss one by one. In bacterial meningitis, the CSF opening pressure is high. In fact, if the opening pressure seems to be very high, suspect bacterial meningitis, because in viral encephalitis, the pressures are usually normal or slightly elevated, usually normal. Alright, so whenever there is a high opening pressure, consider bacterial meningitis. Next is cytology. Normally the cells are less than 5, but if the cells are increased to the tune of more than 1,000. Now I'll give you an example. We received a patient with an EVD from outside, and when we did a CSF, we found the cell count to be 1,66,000, and we just couldn't believe. The cell count can go that high in bacterial meningitis. Alright, so the cells are really high with a neutrophilic predominance. Most of them are neutrophils. So a neutrophilic pleocytosis indicates a bacterial meningitis. There is low glucose. Low means less than 2/3 of the plasma blood sugar, and the proteins are high. And when you do cultures or gram stains, they are positive. Alright, so you have to remember all these points about bacterial meningitis. When you're talking about viral meningitis, you have a lymphocytic pleocytosis. Alright, lymphocytic pleocytosis, however, in the early phase, there may be a predominance of neutrophils as well. The proteins are usually high, but the glucose is usually normal or near normal. Alright, the glucose is not as low as is seen in bacterial meningitis or tubercular meningitis. Alright, so for viral encephalitis, there is a lymphocytic pleocytosis with near normal glucose levels. Am I clear? Oh, okay, next is tubercular. Now tubercular, I have to tell you, in the Western literature, we may not find mention about tubercular meningitis, but in India, it is extremely common, and then at the same time, it is extremely difficult to diagnose TBM. It is usually, an empirical diagnosis, and we begin ATT in patients who have this kind of a picture. Partially treated meningitis and tubercular meningitis, the CSF picture is almost the same. So you have to have a high clinical suspicion. You have to rule out things like any systemic involvement of the body with tuberculosis. Alright, so in tubercular meningitis, there is a lymphocytic pleocytosis, of course. The lymphocytes are more. One thing that is important is the glucose is low. So the glucose would be low in cases of bacterial meningitis as well as tubercular meningitis. But one point that is present is the proteins are very, very high. So very high proteins with low glucose and a lymphocytic predominant pleocytosis indicates a tubercular infection. And then we have certain diagnostic tests which are not exactly, diagnostic as such, but we have the PCRs and everything. We'll discuss them. So am I clear about this table? Any doubts? Fungal I'm not discussing. Seen in immunocompromised, usually the cultures come out to be positive or the PCRs come out to be positive. Alright, so PCR or polymerase chain reaction assay, it is useful aid for the rapid detection of causative pathogens, 100% sensitive, and we can have an assay of Neisseria, Haemophilus influenzae, strep pneumonia, strep tegalacti and listeria. All of them can be assessed. These are the commonest pathogens that cause bacterial meningitis. For viral meningitis panel, I think most of the hospitals now have these. All the viruses are included, including the herpes simplex, which is the most deadly. Alright, cryptococcal antigen assay is present. For tuberculous meningitis, where you are suspecting a tuberculous meningitis, the onset has been insidious. The patient has a history of like 4 to 5 weeks. The patient had fever, malaise, fatigue initially, and now progressing towards its sensorium, and is presented to you with complications of raised intracranial pressure. Suspect TBM in these patients and go in for PCR, Mycobacterium tuberculosis PCR, the gene expert that we talk of. So you detect the Mycobacterium tuberculosis with that, and you also have rifampicin resistance detected with this. Alright, so PCR, CSF ADA, ADAs are increased. So some people going for measuring the CSF ADA as well, and nucleic acid amplification tests. So which are the lab tests that distinguish bacterial from viral meningitis? Now recently the CSF lactate has come up in a big way. CSF lactate levels of more than 4.2 are diagnostic of bacterial meningitis. But more importantly in post-operative neurosurgical patients, because there may be many confounding factors in community-acquired patients, we usually use CSF lactates in post-op or nosocomial infections. CRP concentration. A normal CRP would mean practically no meningitis. So it has a high negative predictive value. Procal, again Procal for sepsis, patients are usually septic. We have a bacterial meningitis score which has 5 criteria. A positive gram stain, a CSF cell count of more than 1000 cells, we have proteins of more than 80, peripheral blood ANC is more than 10,000, and a history of seizure before presentation. So each criteria is given 1 point each, and gram stain, a positive gram stain is given 2 points. So if your score is 2 to 6 points, bacterial meningitis is more likely. This particular score has 99.9% negative predictive value. I hope you understand what is negative predictive value. Okay. Neuroimaging. So the ideal is MRI brain, but it needs resources, it may not be practical in all the patients, so we may go for a CT scan. Can you tell me for what disease, for what type of meningitis encephalitis is CT scan really helpful? Alright. So frontotemporal changes are seen in patients with herpes simplex encephalitis. I'll show you a scan. In TBM you have basal exudates, after contrast, and multiple ring enhancing lesions or tuberculomas may be seen in TBM. And of course then Japanese encephalitis has thalamic and midbrain changes and so on and so forth. So this is an MRI picture of a patient with herpes encephalitis. Can you see the involvement of the left side, frontotemporal regions? Okay. Another scan. What can you see? A ring enhancing lesion or a tuberculoma. What is that? Basal exudates in TBM. Alright, another investigation that we may go in for a patient who is presenting with seizures is EEG. It is strongly recommended in any suspected case, also in patients who have a depressed sensorium in order to rule out non-convulsive status. Alright, so EEG helps us in distinguishing focal encephalitis from generalized encephalopathy. So what do we see in a generalized encephalopathy? If the patient had encephalopathy after sepsis or due to a metabolic cause, there may be a generalized slowing of EEG. But if the patient had a herpes simplex encephalitis or a focal encephalitis, you may see plaids from the temporal region. Okay, plaids are periodic lateralized epileptiform discharges. So you may have plaids. Alright, so EEG may help you. Coming on to the management, I think I have to be fast. Alright, meningitis encephalitis is a neurological emergency, as you all know, because long-term sequelae and mortality depends a lot upon when you start the treatment. Hit fast, hit hard. The only dictum that we tell everybody. Hit fast, you have to be really fast in diagnosing and starting your antibiotics or antivirals, and hit hard. Hard means bactericidal, kill the bacteria, alright? So the golden hour management, the patient comes to you in the first hour, what all do? You assess the ABCs, if a ventilation is required, if resuscitation is required, you measure the blood glucose, vitals, GCS, appropriate resuscitation with fluids and parenteral antibiotics. They have to be started immediately in cases with clinical suspicion of meningitis without waiting for brain imaging or LP. How many of you agree with this? Very few people. So do you think I should perform a CSF analysis prior to starting an antibiotic? No. CSF sterilization takes 4 to 6 hours after initiation of the most sensitive antibiotics. So don't you worry, start your antibiotics, and your antibiotics should be broad spectrum. They should cover both gram-positive and gram-negative organisms. You don't know what organism is causing the meningitis. It should have a reasonable CSF penetration. So your decision to start the antibiotic depends upon how good it penetrates the CSF. I am not saying very good CSF penetration, I am saying reasonable CSF penetration, and I'll tell you why. And bactericidal, it should be able to kill the bacteria. You should not opt for bacteriostatic drugs. And why do I emphasize this? Linezolid. Can anybody tell me, does it have a good CSF penetration? Linezolid. Some say yes, some say no. How many of you say yes? Let me tell you, it has a very good CSF penetration. Is its CSF penetration better than vancomycin? Yes, it is better than vancomycin, much better than vancomycin. Why do we use vancomycin then as a first choice? Good. So, vancomycin is bactericidal while linezolid is bacteriostatic. You do not opt for bacteriostatic drugs in meningitis. You have to hit hard. Alright? I hope you understand the basis. So, which antibiotic to start? In your experience, what do you start? Ceftriaxone and vancomycin. Alright. A third generation cephalosporin to cover the gram-negative organisms like ceftriaxone 2 gram BD and vancomycin for a good gram-positive coverage 1 gram BD. If the patient has a suspected VP shunt infection, I told you gram-negative organisms come into play in nosocomial meningitis. So consider cephalosporins which have a good anti-pseudomonal activity. Alright? Pseudomonas is one of the causative factors in nosocomial meningitis. So go for cephalosporins which have a good anti-pseudomonal activity. Which are they? लिखा हुआ है सब, cefepime, ceftazidime, or you may go in for meropenem. They should be considered to cover resistant gram-negative organisms like Pseudomonas and Acinetobacter along with vancomycin. And if your patient is immunocompromised, I told you, Listeria and Streptococcus agalactiae. Alright, Listeria is very common in immunocompromised patients. Always add ampicillin along with Monocef and vancomycin. Ampicillin in a dose of 2 gram IV 4th hourly. Alright. So, this is a short table of what I told you just now. To cover strep pneumonia, you need 3rd generation plus vancomycin both. For Neisseria, a 3rd generation cephalosporin does well, and so is with Haemophilus influenzae and E. coli. For Listeria and Strep agalactiae, we need to add on ampicillin. Alright, this is again the same thing depending upon the age. So in extremes of age, less than 1 month and more than 50 years, you have to consider Listeria and Streptococcus agalactiae. So you need to add ampicillin in them. In adults, the commonest are Streptococcus pneumonia and Neisseria. So Monoceph vancomycin would do. Alright? In patients who had a head trauma, penetrating trauma, resistant gram-negative, consider meropenem or anti-pseudomonal cephalosporins. Post-neurosurgery, the same profile, gram-negative bacilli come into play. For CSF shunt infections, apart from gram-negative, we also have coagulase-negative staph. Alright, so going for vancomycin plus meropenem. Alright, in patients with suspected herpes encephalitis, now till now you have not done your CSF. The patient has come to you, you have done your golden hour management. So add on acyclovir if you suspect a viral encephalitis. Your patient had seizures, suspect viral encephalitis, add on acyclovir, relatively non-toxic if you maintain your hydration well and the renal functions are fine. In patients with suspected herpes encephalitis, acyclovir in a dose of 10 mg per kg, athawali, and dose adjusted based on renal functions. Acyclovir may be withdrawn after exclusion of herpes encephalitis. Your PCR takes hardly 24 hours. As it is not effective against other viral encephalitis. So even if it is some other viral disease, stop acyclovir. You are not going to help the patient with that. In immunocompromised patients, suspect fungal meningitis and start liposomal amphotericin 3 to 5 mg per kg IV daily. So you have these specific antimicrobial therapy based on isolated pathogen and susceptibility testing. I think we've covered all of this actually. With Pseudomonas, you have to have anti-pseudomonal drugs. Haemophilus influenza, third generation was good. Staph aureus, MRSAs, vancomycin, similarly with cons and enterococcus. Alright, here I want to add on something. A drug called rifampicin. Do you think rifampicin is a good drug to start in meningitis? Does it have a good CSF penetration? Is it bactericidal? Yes. It is bactericidal, it has a good CSF penetration. The only problem is it develops resistance very fast. Alright, so it should be combined with other drugs. So whenever you are suspecting resistant staph, especially in patients who have prosthetic devices in situ, there are VP shunts and you cannot remove them, consider adding rifampicin. Alright, they are very good drugs to be added in cases of nosocomial meningitis with positive organisms. Alright, also in strep pneumonia. In strep pneumonia, in resistant staphs, consider adding rifampicin in combination. Alright, hello, new kids on the block. MDR. Okay, gram-negative, Acinetobacter. How many of you have come across Acinetobacter in your practice? All of you, I think. Resistant to everything but colistin. So, do you think colistin has a good CSF penetration? No. So, what do you do? Intrathecal. Alright. So, whenever we have a doubt about Acinetobacter meningitis, the empirical thing to start is meropenem. Please do not go ahead with colistin straight off. Except if your patient is very, very sick. I mean, practically you have to individualize. If the organism is subsequently found to be resistant to carbapenems, start colistin. And it may also need to be administered by the intraventricular route. Before I go on to the intraventricular antibiotics, I have to tell you the duration. This is not standardized. You know, patients who come to us are usually, they have come from outside, received antibiotics, and usually you have to administer antibiotics for a duration of 3 to 4 weeks. 7 days and stuff doesn't work because we really don't get such patients. So I'm not saying you don't administer it for 7 days. I'm just saying it is not standardized and you have to individualize therapy. So role of intraventricular antimicrobial therapy. So for what infections do you give intraventricular? Highly resistant organisms which are sensitive to antibiotics which have a poor CSF penetration. So please remember you give antibiotics intraventricularly only when they have a poor CSF penetration. So that means you do not give meropenem intraventricularly even if your patient is very sick. Alright, meropenem you don't give because it has a very good CSF penetration. Colistin you may give, vancomycin you may give because the CSF penetration is not as good. Alright, another important drug that we give is amikacin. Alright, but the most common I think these days is colistin. So how much the drug concentration in CSF should be 10 folds more than the MIC value of the pathogen. I'll discuss the doses. EVD if present I hope everybody knows what an EVD is, an external ventricular drainage. It should be clamped for 50 to 60 minutes to allow the agent to equilibrate throughout the CSF. So this is the dosing. I am not discussing each one of them. Colistin is 10 milligrams. That means 50,000 units is the usual dose that we give. Vancomycin, when we give, we usually give 10 milligrams intrathecal if you are doing an LP or intraventricularly through the EVD. Amikacin, we usually give 10 to 20 milligrams. Alright, so after administration of the first dose, additional doses have to be determined by calculation of the inhibitory quotient. This is for theoretical purposes. Let me tell you, sample of CSF is withdrawn to know the trough CSF concentration of the drug. So the trough CSF concentration divided by the MIC of the agent will give you an inhibitory quotient which should be more than 10 to 20 for consistent CSF sterilization. Coming on to viral encephalitis, a quick word. I think we've discussed about this. Wide range of viruses have been reported to cause encephalitis. Specific antiviral therapy for viral encephalitis is generally limited to disease caused by the herpes virus, especially the herpes simplex. Earlier you start the treatment, the less likely that death or serious sequelae will result. So please be prompt in starting treatment for viral encephalitis because these, delay in treatment is an independent predictor of a poor outcome in cases of viral encephalitis. So acyclovir is a drug of choice. Started in all patients with suspected encephalitis. Pending results of diagnostic studies, the dose is 10 milligrams per kg IV every 8 hourly with patients with normal renal function. And these are the predictors of an adverse outcome in patients of viral encephalitis. Age more than 30 years, GCS less than 6, and duration of symptoms prior to starting acyclovir therapy more than 4 days. Mortality decreases to 8% if therapy was initiated less than 4 days of the onset of clinical symptoms. And believe me, this is a very important thing that you should remember. Please start acyclovir. It is relatively non-toxic if you have normal renal functions, but helps in decreasing the mortality to a very great extent. Alright. The treatment for non-herpetic encephalitis, if your patient does not have a herpetic encephalitis but any other virus, please stop acyclovir because the treatment is largely supportive. These infections are usually self-limiting and you just need a close neuromonitoring. Am I clear? Alright, a negative CSF PCR result at the end of therapy is associated with a better outcome. And this is the last segment of my talk. Steroids in meningitis. Should we or should not be? How many of you administer steroids? Wow. Alright, so I'll give you evidence of starting steroids in meningitis. Right. This is a Cochrane review published in 2015 and this is the latest I could find. Corticosteroids for acute bacterial meningitis, and they said corticosteroids significantly reduced hearing loss and neurological sequelae but did not reduce overall mortality. So they say start corticosteroids in patients with pneumococcal meningitis, right? So we usually start steroids concurrently with antibiotics. I'll emphasize on this one again, concurrently with antibiotics in all adults suspected with bacterial meningitis to prevent the release of inflammatory cytokines triggered by bacterial lysis, especially in strep pneumonia meningitis. And the current guideline is, the dose is 10 milligrams. 10 milligrams, please remember, 0.15 milligrams per kg, 6 hourly for 2 to 4 days. So what we usually do is we start 10 milligrams 6 hourly for 4 days, just before or at the same time as starting the antibiotic therapy. If you start it after your antibiotics, it is not going to be helpful. So it should be continued only in patients with cultures positive for pneumococci and should not be given to patients who have previously received antibiotics. This is one deterrent. If the patient is already on antibiotics, please do not start steroids. They are not going to help you. Now, in TBM, steroids in TBM, this was again a Cochrane review published in 2016 and they concluded corticosteroids reduced mortality from tuberculous meningitis at least in the short term. Very helpful in TBM. I think all neurologists the world over would start steroids if they suspect TBM. The reason is TBM has N number of complications, cerebral edema, vasculitic infarcts, raised ICP, hydrocephalus and so on and so forth, and steroids help. So how much Steroids should remain part of standard therapy for tuberculous meningitis. No data exists to compare prednisolone versus dexamethasone. So you may administer any of them, choice based on ease of administration. The treatment duration is 4 weeks. So that's a pretty long time. And this is what tells you about TDM. It takes a long time to recover. Treatment duration is 4 weeks with subsequent gradual tapering over 2 to 4 weeks. Alright? Now, viral encephalitis. In herpes simplex encephalitis, steroids, yes or no? Anti-inflammatory effect of steroids, say yes. No? In the early phase, if you give steroids, it will suppress the host immune response that limits the viral replication. So the consensus is not in the early stage, but if your patient is sick after a few days, 2 to 3 days, 4 days, your patient is sick, he has signs of increased cerebral edema, you may use steroids. Adjuvant use of steroids has been recommended and used to reduce cerebral edema in patients with severe HSV encephalitis. I am talking about severe HSV encephalitis causing cerebral edema. Alright, steroids should not be started in the first go in patients with encephalitis who are recovering well. Now this is the GARCHER trial which is going on. It is a multi-center randomizable blind study. Currently enrolling patients with HSV to assess the outcomes of treatment with acyclovir against the outcomes of treatment with acyclovir plus dexamethasone. The results are still to be out. So that was my talk. To summarize, acute inflammation of meninges is termed meningitis. It may be bacterial, viral or fungal. Neisseria and strep pneumonia are the commonest bacteria. Elderly immunosuppressed, strep pneumonia, listeria. Nosocomial pathogens, staph and gram-negatives, they become more common in hospital-acquired meningitis. HSV encephalitis, though represents only 10 to 15% of all viral cases, they carry a high morbidity and mortality if not treated early. Tuberculous meningitis till date remains a diagnostic challenge, and the diagnosis is empirical in a significant number of patients. In patients where you suspect that it is a meningitis, start parenteral antibiotics immediately without waiting for brain imaging or lumbar puncture. And IV dexamethasone, you should start 10 milligrams every 6 hours for a duration of 2 to 4 days just before or at the same time as antibiotic therapy. IDSA guidelines recommend having a CT done before lumbar puncture where you suspect a high ICP. A lumbar puncture should be done for assessing CSF opening pressure and analysis. This was bacterial meningitis, pleocytosis, neutrophilic predominance, low glucose, positive gram stain. PCR for HSV detection is highly sensitive and specific. Tuberculous meningitis, lymphocytic pleocytosis, decreased glucose and elevated proteins, CSF ADA may be high. You may get a PCR done and nucleic acid amplification test for the aid in diagnosis. And early initiation of antibiotic therapy is a cornerstone for reducing mortality in patients with meningitis.
Thank you, ma'am, for that elaborate talk. Now I request Dr. Jagdish. Dr. Jagdish is a consultant in our department. He will be speaking about interpretation of ECG.